A video game is a piece of software, sitting on media and all its objectivity until it falls prey to data rot. However, when you play a game, your perceptions filter that objectivity. The MDA Framework bridges this gap between the objective game and the subjective player. The MDA Framework, which stands for Mechanics, Dynamics, and Aesthetics, comes from a paper by Robin Hunicki, Marc LeBlanc, and Robert Zubik. Mechanics is the first layer, and it's the most concrete layer. According to the paper, mechanics describes the particular components of the game at the level of data representation and algorithms. Here, they consider the game as a bunch of data and the algorithms that go along with them. And since algorithms are actions that modify data, the mechanics describe a state machine, a series of data, and the actions that change the data. I have a hard time using this word as it's defined. Does the sentence say that a component of the game can be either a piece of data or an algorithm? I think that's what it means. Let's look at Mega Man X. X has some data, like a position, and he has actions, like jumping. Since his position is a piece of data, it's a mechanic. And since jumping is an action, that's a mechanic too. I want to look at this moment from Spark Mandrill's stage in Mega Man X. It contains a number of mechanics. First, you can see some data. X himself has a position. There's an enemy, and that enemy has a position. X is shooting a projectile, and that projectile has a position, and it has a vector. There are also some actions going on in this screen. The enemy will shoot upward at 45-degree angles or horizontally. X is shooting shotgun ice. And shotgun ice has its own action. When it hits the wall, it bounces off in a spread pattern. When X touches an enemy, he takes damage, and when X touches a bullet, he takes damage too. There are quite a few more actions that can happen here, but I just wanted to name a few to give you the idea. I have a couple extra notes that I'd like to share about mechanics. First, if you understand mechanics to contain every aspect of the game state, or in other words, if the field of mechanics represents a complete model of the game, then that means that visuals and audio are data too. X's sprite and Spark Mandrill's theme song are here, just like all of the other data, so they take part in mechanics too. Second, it's tempting to think of a mechanic as a part of code, like it's a variable or a particular function. However, I don't have the source code, so saying that would be both misleading and unhelpful. There's nothing objective I can pinpoint when I call something a mechanic. It's just what I recognize in the game from observing it. So, when I identify a mechanic, I'm picking a particular aspect, which to me seems like a discrete chunk of data or algorithm. That said, mechanics are observable aspects of a game, so they're not entirely open to interpretation. If I tell you X can walk, that's true. If I tell you X can jump down through floors, that's false. Mechanics aren't perfectly objective, but they are falsifiable. Lastly, the authors offer a second definition of mechanics. They say, mechanics are the various actions, behaviors, and control mechanisms afforded to the player within a game context. I don't know the purpose of the second definition. By limiting itself to actions and tying itself to the player, this definition only references a subset of the earlier definition of mechanics. It takes away from the thrust of the MDA framework, which uses mechanics to encompass the entirety of a game's data and actions. I'm reluctant to mention this definition, but I think it would be deceptive not to mention that it's in the paper. On the other hand, the first definition for mechanics encompasses literally everything in the game. Any piece of data and any action is its own mechanic. So you might wonder, what's the use of having such a broad definition? Well, the usefulness comes out when the paper defines its next term. The layer of mechanics is the most concrete part of the MDA framework. Moving up to dynamics, it gets just a little more abstract. The paper says that dynamics describes the runtime behavior of the mechanics acting on player inputs and each other's outputs over time. This is a mouthful, so I want to take it bit by bit. The term runtime refers to a program at the moment that it's executed. In other words, this means you're actually playing the game when dynamics happen. Recall that mechanics outline the game's state machine. So, the runtime behavior of mechanics refers to going through that state machine and witnessing as actions modify data leading to new states. Some actions in the game read player input, like when you press B on the controller and X jumps. Not all mechanics are dependent on the player, though, like the turret enemy's position and when it shoots. I think these last two phrases are distracting. They say that dynamics arise from all mechanics, regardless of whether the mechanics handle player input or not. Well, I wouldn't have assumed there was a distinction in the first place. The game's mechanics work as time progresses, so that the game moves through a sequence of states to produce a dynamic. In short, a dynamic is the flow of mechanics that happens when you play the game. You can picture this as a sequence or tree of states. You could say that a dynamic is a group of related mechanics. Since dynamics must occur during actual gameplay, they sit between the game and the player. The game must have mechanics to support a dynamic, and the player must play the game to see dynamics arise. So earlier, when I was talking about mechanics in Spark Mandrel stage, I talked about how X has a position, and the enemy has a position, and X can shoot and the shot bounces off walls, and the enemy can shoot too. And combining all of these things, I see two dynamics. First, the enemy and the bullets create danger zones. X will be damaged if he touches an enemy or a bullet, and the enemy here will shoot bullets at different angles. The enemy has a position, and the bullets will occupy a series of positions according to how they are shot. This creates a collection of spaces where X might get hit depending on the timing. So, when you combine all of this data, which is made possible by the action of the enemy shooting, you get the dynamic of danger zones. Second, Shotgun Ice creates a dynamic of shooting around corners. There's a wall right in front of X, and an enemy right below X. Also, Shotgun Ice reflects in a spread pattern when it hits a wall. So, when the ice reflects here, it's able to shoot around the corner to right below X. So this dynamic is made possible by data like X's position and the enemy's position, and it's also made possible by actions like X can shoot, Shotgun Ice bounces off walls into a spread pattern, and the enemy gets damaged when it gets hit by Shotgun Ice. So, both of these dynamics happen because of the combination of multiple mechanics during gameplay. Aesthetics marks the final and most abstract portion of the MDA Framework. The paper states that aesthetics describes the desirable emotional responses evoked in the player when she interacts with the game system. At this point, the framework leaps into the experience of the player. This sounds like the good feelings you have when you play a game, but Hunicki and company give some examples to flesh out this definition. There's sensation, fantasy, narrative, challenge, fellowship, discovery, expression, and submission. These terms refer to the sensation of playing a game. They're speaking in a broader sense than just emotions. You might be drawn into the world of a fantasy game, clash against a challenging game, or anticipate every corner in a discovery game. In this way, they're like genres. Aesthetics grow out of dynamics because they reflect the player's experience in playing the game. Mechanics define what the game can do. Dynamics define how mechanics work during gameplay. And aesthetics define the player's reaction to the sum total of dynamics that they experience in gameplay. So, going back to Spark Mandrill, I considered two dynamics. First, there were the danger zones, and second, there was the corner shooting that you could do with shotgun ice. Combining these, X can shoot at the turret without ever crossing into a danger zone. Using just his regular buster gun, he'd have to line up horizontally with the turret, putting himself at risk. But with the shotgun ice, he can stay out of direct fire. These two dynamics, working together, give the scenario a stealth aesthetic, since X shoots directly at the turret while remaining outside of its line of fire. So, when you talk about a game and you say, it had great exploration, or I thought the shooting was crappy, you're talking about aesthetics. That's your final interpretation, based on your collection of gameplay experiences. The hard part is going back and finding out how those aesthetics arose from the mechanics and dynamics of the game. In all, the MDA framework outlines 3 layers of abstraction. Mechanics cover the individual data and actions of the game. Dynamics label a group of mechanics in gameplay. And aesthetics label the player's experience of a group of dynamics. As they become further abstract, they grow more subjective. Mechanics are discrete and immediate in the game. Dynamics only occur through gameplay, and aesthetics depend on a player's interpretation of a game. I got some responses to this essay. My friend Adrian had this to say about the definition of mechanic. I'm not sure how effective considering a mechanic to be any distinguishable set of rules in a game is. In response, I'd like to say that I think the framework works, because mechanics are broad enough to cover anything in the game. For example, the counter-argument to Adrian would be to say that he uses the word rule like the paper uses the word mechanic. And on the Ludology subreddit, Lasgrain said this: visuals and audio are not data. They are unaffected by algorithms and unchanging no matter what happens in-game. They are representation of data. The thing is, the standing sprite didn't get fed into an algorithm, it was the character coordinate that did. The new data is the new coordinate, not the walking animation. Both the sprite and animation are just used to represent the character coordinate and how it changes through algorithms. If you take out the graphic and, let's say, have the computer print out English sentences to describe the game state, then mechanically, the game is unchanged. I think Lasgrain's argument is that visuals and audio are not data because they can't be manipulated. I think there are 3 counter-arguments. First, the pointers to visuals and audio definitely change. The music pointer, for instance, will change from the stage select theme, to the Spark Mandrill theme, to to the boss theme, so on and so forth. Second, the paper makes no distinction between data that can be manipulated and data that can't be manipulated. You should take the framework one step at a time, building a full appreciation of data before moving on to consider dynamics. Third, mechanics are a concrete representation of the game. To say you can swap out one thing for another, even one set of graphics for another set of graphics, means you've already taken a step towards abstraction. But I think both of these responses are worth sharing so that you can make up your own mind.